Today in PA is sponsored by Renewal by Andersen of Central Pennsylvania. Get $400 off windows and $800 off doors, plus a free upgrade to Smart Sunglass during their summer sale now through August 31st. That's at no money down, no payments, and no interest for a whole year. Drop by renewalbyandersen.com for additional details. Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning into this special Today in PA interview with John Luciew, PennLive crime reporter, as he discusses his latest series on Harrisburg serial killer Joey Miller. John, would you please give us a little bit of a background on Joey Miller just to start things off?
All right. Well, Joey Miller is Harrisburg's, only known official serial killer. He was operating in the shadows of inner city bars and street corners all around Harrisburg, starting in about 1986 and continuing on until his capture, quite by accident, on August 6, 1992. He was caught along some railroad tracks in Susquehanna Township, which is right outside of Harrisburg, in the process of raping and beating a black woman who he picked up in a Harrisburg bar. And that was where the story begins of this FBI-trained police detective trying to unravel the many victims that Joey Miller had amassed over those years where he was going to bars and drinking and doing drugs and raping and killing with abandon. So that's what the story is about, sort of the cat and mouse game between Miller and this detective, as told through these confession tapes, which the detective provided to PennLive, along with about 11 hours of other interviews of Joey Miller's family and friends and some acquaintances of the victims.
With serial killers, there's this podcast called Last Podcast on the Left, which does true crime and a lot of other paranormal stories. And in doing deep dives on serial killers like the Night Stalker and Ted Bundy, they describe something called the serial killer soup, which is main ingredients that seem to go into making these guys. And one of them is head injuries that they suffer as children that may have affected them. Another is, abusive childhoods. What was Joey Miller's background? Did he have any sort of signs that he would be doing such atrocious acts in his adulthood?
He had a hard scrabble childhood in a real sort of, lower working class section of Stilton, which is right outside of Harrisburg, and it was known for its steel mill. Bethlehem Steel had a plant there for decades. He had some older brothers who picked on him. He has been tested, his IQ is tested as low as 59. I think his highest was in the 80s somewhere. He did have a lot of mischief that he got into, and he was sent away to a juvenile home. A teacher who knew him kind of earmarked him to be a bad person. He actually had a run-in with the law in his teens, where late teens, maybe early 20s, where he pulled a shotgun on a cop. In a previous story I had done when they wrapped up the last of his victims back in 2016, the cop kind of regretted not just pulling the trigger and blowing him away, because it would have headed off this run that he went on as a serial killer. And he was known to be a sort of fight to the death type of guy. Like if you scrapped with him, he was going to keep coming at you until you put him down. In other words, he had a very long and colorful reputation in Stilton, but he also sort of logged a lot of run-ins with the law leading up to, this homicide investigation.
Would it be safe to say that no one was surprised that he was pegged for this crime?
Yes, few were surprised. And in fact, these interrogation tapes of his friends and family show that he was bragging about it all the while as it was unfolding. And one of his relatives even agreed to wear a wire as they were investigating one of the early disappearances of one of his victims back in 1987. What Joey Miller did do well was dispose of the victims so that most of them were not found until he led police to this burial ground, which was in a landfill outside of Harrisburg. These women who picked up in bars, some of whom may have worked as prostitutes. So, it's kind of an unfortunate commentary on the times, back in the late 80s and early 90s, that the disappearances weren't attracting a lot of press attention and clamoring, for them to be solved. They were somehow written off as disposable people. This wasn't a high-profile case until it turned out that a serial killer was behind all of this. A couple of law enforcement people commented that he chose the right victim to keep getting away with it because there was not this huge outcry to solve these disappearances as these women were disappearing.
Not the white debutantes, as he says.
Exactly right. Yeah, he made that comment to the detective who sort of was the lead detective who took his confessions and then actually came out of retirement 23 years after Joey Miller was first arrested to wrap up the case and achieve justice for the last two of his victims.
Why do you think Joey Miller led Tomas Brennan, the detective, to the bodies?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, Brennan is an old school guy. I mean, he worked for the state police for 24 years. He took the FBI profilers course at Quantico, did some consulting work for them, and then landed in the spot that would put him face to face with Joey Miller as Dauphin County's chief of detectives. So he was called to that first scene at the Conrail tracks when Joey Miller had bolted, but the victim was there. Joey Miller's car was there. His, quote, murder kit was there. The duct tape, the rope, the knife, cooler of beer on ice. He was literally partying and killing and raping. You know what I mean? This was fun for him. But Brennan is an intimidating guy, and he told Miller from the very first, I'm going to get you for all of your kills. And he was true on that in terms of the 5 that we know about. Now, there's always been speculation that there are more, and even Brennan sort of harbors some unsettling thoughts that there were more, perhaps out of state down in North Carolina, because there was a connection with North Carolina and one of his early attempts at being a rapist in Harrisburg, where he was witnessed by another person abducting a woman at gunpoint and raping her at gunpoint. Now, this woman was said to have been left alive by this witness, who then told that to another relative and eventually made its way to police. But police developed further information that both this witness and Joey Miller had a North Carolina connection, where Joey was going down on a regular basis. And when they did contact police down in North Carolina, there were multiple homicide victims and disappearances that fit his victim profile. But again, those investigations were so cut short or done at the very surface that there was not enough hard evidence to really tie Joey Miller to any of them. In other words, when they did try to make that connection, there was, this was another case where these victims were seen as somewhat disposable, and the police investigation was not as thorough as you would hope it would be. Thus, Brennan and his counterparts up here could never really advance the ball and really try to tie him to any of those cases. And in fact, during confession, Brennan does ask Miller about other victims out of state, and Miller denies it. And if you look at how he did the investigation, he would always have some facts that he could challenge Miller's denials with, and that would eventually open him up to move him along to give him more detail and confession. As far as taking to the bodies, Brennan is convinced one of Miller's great satisfactions was being around his kills, and that's why he buried them in a landfill, but actually had grave markers made up of debris that would allow him to go out there and keep reliving those kills by visiting those graves in that burial ground. And this idea of being able to take police to these bodies, I think, excited him. And Brennan thinks that as well. And he describes that in the story. And we did a 2.5-hour video interview with Brennan as well.
Do you think he's going to fess up to more locations before he dies? Because in the pictures you have of him, he does not look like he's doing too hot in jail.
Back in 2016, Brennan said that he had a scar from some open heart surgery and the staples were still in his chest. And Brennan, he did like to push Miller's buttons. And he said, well, you want me to pull those staples out for you, Joey? And Joey was actually given the death penalty and was spared from that by an early 2000s Supreme Court decision that said mentally handicapped people could not be executed, or that was cruel and unusual punishment. And the local judge in the Joey Miller case said by virtue of his low IQ that Miller qualified and he was spared the death penalty, much to Brennan's chagrin, because Brennan told Miller that he wanted a front row seat for that and he wanted to wave goodbye to him.
Wow.
So, yeah, he was not playing the good cop with Joey Miller. Let's put it that way.
I mean, the whole case is very theatrical, from his escape to when he was captured by that mistake. I mean, he was on the roof for how long before cops got him?
That was another one of Brennan. Without even knowing who this person was, he predicted that he was going to go back home, shower, try to get rid of any physical evidence on himself, and then he would pull something crazy, which was going up on top of the roof. And Brennan said, well, don't worry about it. He's not going anywhere. He's not going to jump. As soon as it gets hot, don't give him any water, don't give him any food. He'll come down. Because you were talking about early August, in Harrisburg on a tar roof. So that's what happened. He got hot and, was up there, but made a big show of it at the time. And I guess some of his friends and neighbors and relatives were down there sitting on lawn chairs, some of them cheering him on to jump. And at the time, all they had him was for sexual assault on the woman who was the victim who survived at the railroad tracks. They didn't have him on any murders at that point.
What a frustrating case, because you're essentially relying on the narrative of someone who has really no incentive to be honest with anybody at this point, because he's going away for life no matter what. So why wouldn't he play around with Brennan and the other detectives?
Right, yeah. But, the one thing that Brennan describes is when he does get to talking about his victims and his kills, the excitement overtakes him. He apparently has a vein that snakes along one side of his forehead, and Brennan can see the pulse as registered in that vein pumping and accelerating and quickening, and that's when he knows he's on a roll, and even against his perhaps better judgment wants to just talk about it because it excites him and he gets a thrill out of just talking about it.
Do you think that perhaps that's why he was eventually caught, or do you think it was pure luck?
Well, as far as how he was caught, it was truly just happenstance. I think they were doing a pipeline project along this stretch of railroad track, and the hole was already dug, a hole that was going to be apparently filled in the next day. So that was going to be sort of where Joey was going to bury this latest victim. And it just happened to be this Conrail security guy walking the track and stumbling on it. Basically, this guy with the trunk popped and the beer cooler out and this woman bound up and him sort of having just raped and beat her. And he bolts because here's the thing. He was already bragging about some of these victims. He was bragging about it to anybody who would listen. In fact, he went to one of his relatives after one of the early kills and asked for a shovel.
And the relative never asked any follow-up questions?
Well, according to one of the relatives, I believe it was his wife, who was interviewed by police, he said he killed somebody and he needed a shovel. Yeah, he told multiple people that he had killed these black women who were missing. Several of the ones that were in the news, a relative who made it known to police and who agreed to wear a wire to try to record him talking about this, but Joey sensed something was up, and he never talked about it around this guy, and in fact wasn't even going to see him.
I mean, realistically, he could have still been active if he hadn't been luckily caught randomly.
Right. Yeah.
Just a little gruesome food for thought as we end this interview. John, thank you so much for joining us, and you listeners can check out the 3-part series up now on PennLive.com. Today in PA is sponsored by Renewal by Andersen of Central Pennsylvania. Get $400 off windows and $800 off doors, plus a free upgrade to Smart Sunglass during their summer sale now through August 31st. That's at no money down, no payments, and no interest for a whole year. Drop by renewalbyandersen.com for additional details.